The world looked at Ethel Kennedy and saw a woman standing at the center of an American legend. She had the famous name. She had the grand house. She had the photographs filled with children, dogs, relatives, political visitors, and the restless movement of a family that seemed larger than ordinary life. To the public, Hickory Hill looked like a place where history was alive. It looked like laughter on the lawn, touch football in the grass, famous guests at the dinner table, children running through rooms that had once belonged to John and Jacqueline Kennedy, a young mother with bright eyes and endless energy, a husband who seemed to carry the moral promise of a country still trying to believe in itself. But behind that image was a different story, a story of 11 children born into privilege but not protected from pain, a story of a father whose death turned childhood into inheritance, a story of a mother who had to keep a family standing while the world watched, judged, admired, and mythologized everything they did. Ethel Kennedy's children were not simply children of wealth. They were children of a political dynasty. They were children of assassination. They were children of a name so powerful that it shaped their lives before they were old enough to understand it. They inherited access, education, history, and public fascination. But they also inherited grief. They inherited expectation. They inherited the burden of continuing a dream that had been interrupted by gunfire. Some of them would turn that burden into public service. Some would build careers in law, politics, journalism, filmmaking, business, and human rights. Some would step away from the spotlight as much as anyone with the Kennedy name could. Some would become controversial. Some would become symbols of survival. And two of them would die far too young. David, lost to addiction and an overdose before he reached 30. Michael, killed in a skiing accident at 39, after a period of public scandal and private strain. The Kennedy family has often been described through the language of a curse. But the story of Ethel Kennedy's 11 children is not simply a story about fate. It is a story about what happens when public glory and private damage live inside the same house. It is about children growing up beneath a father's unfinished legacy. It is about a mother who refused to collapse, even when life gave her every reason to. It is about a family name that opened every door, but could not always lead its children safely through them. To understand what happened to Ethel Kennedy's children, we have to begin before they were born, before the assassinations, before Hickory Hill became a symbol of crowded American tragedy, before Robert Kennedy became a martyr, before Ethel became the widow who never remarried. We have to begin with the world that made her strong, and perhaps also made softness difficult. Ethel Skakel was born into a wealthy Catholic family, a family with money, confidence, and a taste for competition. The Skakels were not quiet, old money figures who moved through life with polished restraint. They were active, energetic, and often loud. Their world valued courage, sport, physical daring, loyalty, and toughness. It was a world where children learned early that fear was something to push through. That lesson would serve Ethel in the years to come. But it would also become complicated, because the ability to push through pain can be a gift when survival is required. It can also become a burden when pain needs to be understood, spoken, or healed. Ethel met Robert Kennedy as a young woman through his sister Jean. The connection made sense almost immediately. They came from similar worlds, large Catholic families, strong fathers, money, ambition, discipline, and an instinct for competition. They were not delicate people. They were energetic, intense, and driven by something larger than comfort. When Ethel married Robert Kennedy in 1950, she did not simply marry a man. She married into a machine. The Kennedy family was already organizing itself around public power. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had raised his children with enormous ambition. Politics was not treated as a casual interest. It was a family enterprise. Every person mattered, every marriage mattered, every public appearance mattered. The Kennedy sons were expected to carry the name upward. The Kennedy wives were expected to support the mission. The Kennedy children were born into a story that had already been written before they could speak. Robert Kennedy was not the first son. That mattered. He had grown up in the shadow of his older brothers, especially John, but he possessed his own intensity, his own moral seriousness, and his own ambition. Over time, he would become one of the central figures in American public life. At first, though, he and Ethel were a young couple building a family. Their children arrived quickly. Kathleen in 1951, Joseph in 1952, Robert Jr. in 1954, David in 1955, Courtney in 1956, Michael in 1959, Christopher in 1963, Matthew in 1965, Douglas in 1967, and Rory in December 1968, 6 months after her father was killed. 11 children in 17 years. It is difficult to imagine the scale of that household. Hickory Hill, the estate in McLean, Virginia, became the center of their lives. It had once belonged to John and Jackie Kennedy, but under Robert and Ethel, it became something different. It became a home overflowing with movement. Children everywhere, animals everywhere. Visitors arriving without the house ever seeming fully prepared or fully surprised. Dogs, horses, birds, and sometimes animals that seemed more suited to a small zoo than a political household. Games outside, arguments inside. Dinners that could include family members, writers, activists, politicians, artists, and journalists. For outsiders, it was irresistible. It made the Kennedys seem not only powerful, but alive. They were not cold aristocrats hiding behind old portraits. They were physically present, competitive, noisy, and full of appetite for the world. The house suggested a kind of democratic aristocracy, wealth without stillness, privilege without silence, old money with muddy shoes and children underfoot. But what looked lively from the outside could be overwhelming from within. A child in a family of 11 must fight in some way to be seen. Not always cruelly, not always consciously, but naturally. There are only so many hours in a day. Only so much quiet attention available in a house that never stops moving. Robert Kennedy loved his children deeply. Public accounts often describe him as a father who made time when he could. He played with them. He involved them. He took them seriously. He was not such a distant public man who appeared at the dinner table like a guest. But he was also absent often. The demands of his brother's presidency, his own role as Attorney General, his work in the Senate, and later his presidential campaign pulled him away. The children had a father who mattered to the country. That meant the country often had a claim on him. This is one of the quiet injuries of dynastic families. The parent belongs to history before the child has finished needing them. Ethel became the constant force inside the home. She managed the children, the guests, the social world, the family culture, and the emotional rhythm of the house. She was not fragile. She was not retiring. She was tough, devout, sharp, and energetic. She believed in loyalty. She believed in family. She believed in keeping going. But keeping going is not the same as stopping to ask where the pain has settled. And pain was coming. The first great shock for the children was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. For the country, it was a national wound. For the family, it was personal devastation. The children were young, but the atmosphere changed. Their uncle had been president. Their father had been his closest political partner and emotional companion. After John's death, Robert was altered. He became quieter in some ways, deeper, more visibly burdened. The Kennedy family was no longer only a symbol of youth and possibility. It was now a family marked by murder. Still, they moved forward. That was the Kennedy way. Grief did not stop the public mission. It became part of it. Robert Kennedy entered the Senate. He spoke more openly about poverty, race, injustice, war, and moral responsibility. By 1968, when he ran for president, he was not simply trying to win office. To many Americans, he seemed to represent a chance to repair something broken. For his children, the campaign was both exciting and unstable. Their father was loved by crowds. He traveled constantly. He spoke to strangers who reached for him as if he could carry their hopes. The children saw the admiration. They understood that he mattered. But the more he belonged to the public, the less he belonged only to them. Then came June 1968. Robert Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles after winning the California Democratic primary. He died the next day. Ethel was 40 years old and pregnant with their 11th child. The public mourned another Kennedy assassination. But inside Hickory Hill, 11 childhoods were permanently divided. There was before and there was after. Kathleen, the oldest, was 16. She was old enough to understand the full reality of what had happened, but still young enough to need a father through the most important years of becoming an adult. Joseph was 15, the oldest son, suddenly closer to the symbolic center of the family's expectations. Robert Jr. was 14. David was 12. Courtney was 11. Michael was 10. Kerry was 8. Christopher was almost 5. Matthew was 3. Douglas was a little over one. Rory had not yet been born. The younger children would know their father through stories, photographs, public footage, and the reverence of others. The older children would remember him as a living person, but even their memories would be crowded by the national myth that formed after his death. That is a difficult thing for a child. When a parent dies young, the family mourns a person. When a public figure is assassinated, the world turns that person into a symbol, and symbols can be hard for children to grieve. A symbol cannot disappoint you. A symbol cannot be ordinary. A symbol cannot sit at the breakfast table and be tired, impatient, distracted, funny, affectionate, or flawed. Robert Kennedy became larger in death. His children had to grow up in the shadow of that enlargement. Ethel never remarried. To the public, this became part of her legend. She remained the widow of Robert Kennedy, loyal to his memory, devoted to the children, faithful to the family's ideals. In American memory, she became a figure of endurance. But real endurance is not cinematic. It is repetitive. It is practical. It is getting children through school, through grief, through adolescence, through rebellion, through press attention, through addiction, through marriages, through divorce, through scandal, through funerals. Ethel had money, yes. She had help, she had family, she had social power. But no amount of privilege could make the task simple. She had to raise 11 children in a house haunted by absence, and each child responded differently. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, the eldest, became one of the clearest examples of how a Kennedy child could transform inheritance into public service. As the firstborn, she carried the earliest memories of the family before the worst losses. She remembered her father not merely as an image on a wall, but as a presence in the house. She had seen the political world up close. She had watched public life take her father away and then, in the cruelest possible way, take him forever. Kathleen moved toward politics and civic engagement. She attended Radcliffe and later built a career that led her to become Lieutenant Governor of Maryland. Her public life was serious and substantial, and yet every Kennedy who enters politics must face the same question. Where does personal ambition end and inherited duty begin? For Kathleen, public service could be an act of belief, but it could also be an act of memory. She represented continuity, the eldest daughter stepping into the world not as a decorative heir, but as a working public figure. Still, even in achievement, the family shadow remained. The Kennedy name brings attention, but it also brings comparison. No accomplishment is received as entirely private. No failure is small. No campaign is only a campaign. When Kathleen ran for governor of Maryland and lost, it did not erase her career, but it marked the limit of one branch of the family's political continuation. Like many Kennedy stories, hers was not simply triumph or defeat. It was effort under pressure. And as the years passed, Kathleen also became a witness. She watched siblings struggle. She watched public controversies gather around the family. She watched two brothers die. She watched her mother continue to stand in the center of the family year after year. In another family, being the oldest child is already a role. In this family, it meant carrying memory for everyone younger. Joseph Kennedy, too, the second child and oldest son, inherited a different weight. The oldest Kennedy son is never just a son. He is a possible heir. Joe Kennedy, too, entered public life with all the expectations that came with his name. He served in Congress from Massachusetts and built a reputation around practical social concern, especially through Citizens Energy, the nonprofit he founded to help provide fuel assistance to people in need. His career had substance. It was not only family branding. He seemed, for a time, like someone who might carry the political line forward in a major way. But the Kennedy name does not allow private life to remain private. Joe's first marriage to Sheila Rauch ended, and his attempt to obtain a Catholic annulment became a painful public controversy. For him, it may have been a religious process. For his former wife, it was experienced as a denial of the reality of a long marriage and the family they had built. She spoke publicly and wrote about the experience, giving the controversy emotional and moral force. The damage affected Joe's political future. He did not pursue the path many expected, including a possible run for governor of Massachusetts. He stepped back from elected office and continued public work through Citizens Energy. There is a quiet sadness in that turn, not the sadness of death, but the sadness of a life that seemed directed toward one destiny and then moved away from it. Joe did not disappear. He did not fail in any simple sense, but the great dynastic expectation around him softened, complicated, and then faded. The Kennedy family was built around public office as a kind of inheritance. Joe's life showed that inheritance could be refused, interrupted, or made too costly by personal events. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the third child, became perhaps the most publicly complicated of all Ethel's children. As a boy, he had the energy, intensity, and appetite for risk that seemed to run through the family, but he also carried the wound of losing his father young. Like several of his siblings, he entered adolescence with grief as part of the landscape. In his youth and early adulthood, Robert Jr. struggled with drug dependency. His 1983 arrest for heroin possession became a public turning point. In a private family, it would have been a serious crisis. In the Kennedy family, it became national news. But that moment did not define the whole of his life. As part of his sentence, he became involved with environmental work connected to the Hudson River. That work grew into a long career as an environmental lawyer and advocate. For many years, he was known for fighting polluters, defending waterways, and using the Kennedy platform for environmental causes. There is something very Kennedy about that transformation. A fall, then a reinvention, a public wound, then public service. But Robert Jr.'s life also became increasingly controversial. His views on vaccines and public health brought criticism from scientists, public health officials, and members of his own family. His later political activities placed him in open tension with many Kennedy relatives who felt his positions threatened the public legacy associated with the name. That family disagreement mattered. The Kennedys had always contained private tensions, but they were famous for public unity. When siblings publicly distanced themselves from Robert Jr., it suggested that even the old rules of family loyalty had limits. His personal life also carried sorrow. His second wife, Mary Richardson Kennedy, died in 2012 during a period of severe personal distress. Their marriage had been troubled, and the circumstances around her death were deeply painful and public. She left behind children who became part of the next generation, touched by the family's long history of grief. Robert Jr. is not easy to reduce. He has been an environmental advocate, a recovering addict, a controversial public figure, a political candidate, a son of a murdered father, a brother in a divided family, and a man whose life has been repeatedly lived under national inspection. His story shows one of the central tensions of the Kennedy inheritance. The same name that gives a person a platform also magnifies every mistake, every belief, every contradiction. Then came David. David Anthony Kennedy may be the most heartbreaking of Ethel's children, because his life seemed so directly marked by the night his father was killed. He was 12 in June 1968, old enough to understand terror, young enough to be permanently shaped by it. Public accounts have often described David as deeply affected by his father's assassination. Some reports say he watched the events unfold through television coverage. However the details are remembered, what is clear is that he was a boy when violence entered the center of his life. Trauma in childhood does not always appear as grief alone. It can become fear. It can become self-destruction. It can become the search for escape. It can become a feeling that the world is unsafe and cannot be made safe again. David struggled through adolescence and young adulthood. Drugs became part of his life. He went through treatment, relapses, and public incidents that deepened the family's pain. The press covered his difficulties not simply as the struggle of a young man, but as another chapter in the Kennedy tragedy. That must have been its own kind of cruelty. To suffer is painful. To have strangers turn your suffering into a pattern, a headline, a myth, is something else. David was not a curse. He was a wounded son. The Kennedy culture admired toughness. It admired motion. It admired the ability to rise after a blow. But not every wound responds to motion. Some wounds need stillness, patience, privacy, and language. David may not have received enough of those things in time. In 1984, he died of an overdose in Palm Beach. He was 28 years old. For the country, it was another Kennedy loss. For Ethel, it was the death of her child. There is no public language large enough for that. No political legacy, no family fortune, no national sympathy can make a mother's grief less absolute. She had already lost her husband to violence. Now she had lost a son to the long aftermath of pain, and she still had other children to raise, guide, and worry over. Courtney Kennedy, the fifth child, lived a life that moved through activism, family, and relative privacy. Her marriage to Paul Hill, one of the Guildford Four, connected her to a story of wrongful conviction and Irish political injustice. In that choice, one could see the Kennedy family's long emotional connection to Ireland and to civil rights. But Courtney's life also reminds us that not every child of a famous family becomes a central public figure. Some live partly in the light and partly outside it. Courtney's path had public elements, but she did not become one of the most politically visible Kennedy children. That does not make her life less important. In a family like this, the quieter children often reveal something essential: the struggle to build personal identity without becoming only a supporting character in a larger legend. For Courtney, as for several of her siblings, the question was not simply what she would achieve. It was whether she could own a life that the public did not already think it owned. Michael Kennedy, the sixth child, seemed at times to embody the family's charm and drive. He worked with citizens' energy and appeared committed to the kind of social work associated with the Kennedy tradition. He had energy, public ease, and the confidence of a man born into a family that expected engagement with the world. But in the 1990s, Michael's personal life became the subject of serious controversy. Reports emerged about an inappropriate relationship with the family's teenage baby sitter. The scandal damaged his reputation and placed him under intense public scrutiny. For any family, such allegations would be painful. For A. Kennedy, they struck at something larger. The Kennedys had always presented themselves at their best as a family of public purpose and moral seriousness. Scandal did not only harm the individual, it threatened the image of the family itself. Michael's marriage to Victoria Gifford was also collapsing. Then came the accident. On December 31, 1997, Michael died while skiing in Aspen, Colorado. He was playing ski football, a game in which family members passed a football while skiing. He struck a tree and was killed. He was 39. The suddenness of it was devastating. One moment a family holiday, the next another catastrophe. Michael's death came after a period of disgrace, which made the emotional tone even more complicated. He died before his public story had time to settle, before repair or accountability or reinvention could fully take shape. Death froze him in the public mind at the intersection of scandal and tragedy. But for Ethel, again, the public framing was secondary. She had lost another son. David had died in 1984. Michael died in 1997. Two sons gone before 40. A family can survive one unimaginable loss and still be shattered by the next. Ethel's survival has often been praised, but praise can sometimes miss the private reality. Survival is not the absence of suffering. It is suffering that continues to breathe. Kerry Kennedy, the seventh child, carried forward one of the clearest versions of her father's public ideals. She became a human rights advocate and a central figure in Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. Her work has taken her into global issues, legal advocacy, and public campaigns against injustice. In many ways, Kerry turned inheritance into mission. She did not simply possess the Kennedy name, she used it. But mission does not spare a person from private strain. Her marriage to Andrew Cuomo, a member of another prominent political family, seemed at first to unite two powerful public lineages. Kennedy and Cuomo, two names associated with Catholic identity, democratic politics, and public ambition. But the marriage ended in divorce. The end was covered publicly because both families were visible, both names recognizable. Once again, the private life of an Ethel Kennedy child became a matter of public discussion. Kerry continued her human rights work. She remained active, articulate, and visible. Her life demonstrates both the strength and the pressure of the Kennedy tradition. To devote oneself to justice can be meaningful. It can also be emotionally demanding when the work is tied to the memory of a father's absence shaped everything. For Kerry, the legacy was not only a shadow, it was an assignment. Christopher Kennedy, born in 1963, belonged to the younger group of children who had only a brief time with their father. He was still very small when Robert was killed, young enough that memory itself would have been fragile. For children like Christopher, the father existed partly as personal memory and partly as family mythology. That is a strange way to grow up, to be told again and again what your father meant, while having only fragments of your own direct experience. Christopher built a career in business and civic life, especially in Illinois. He served in public roles and later ran for governor of Illinois, though he did not win the Democratic nomination. His attempt at politics shows how persistent the Kennedy current remained. Even those who grew up after the great early tragedies still felt the pull of public service. The name carried expectation across time. It did not end with Robert's death. It transferred quietly and repeatedly to the next generation. But Christopher's life also shows the limits of the name. Kennedy recognition can open doors, but it does not guarantee victory. It can attract attention, but attention is not the same as trust. It can provide a beginning, but not an ending. Matthew Kennedy, often known as Max, became one of the more private of Ethel's children. Privacy in this family is worth noticing. In ordinary life, a person who avoids publicity is simply private. In a dynasty, privacy can look like refusal. It can look like escape. It can look like wisdom. Matthew's lower public profile suggests another way of carrying the Kennedy name, not by constantly performing it, but by living around it. For a family so often consumed by public narrative, a quieter life may be a kind of self-protection. It is easy for viewers to focus on the most dramatic lives, the deaths, the scandals, the political campaigns, the controversies. But the quieter lives matter too. They show that not every heir to a powerful name must become a symbol. Some simply try to live, and in a family with so much tragedy, that effort should not be underestimated. Douglas Kennedy, born in 1967, was only a baby when his father was killed. He grew up with almost no living memory of Robert Kennedy, and yet his entire identity was shaped by being Robert's son. He later built a career in journalism and television, including work with Fox News, which placed him in a somewhat unusual position given the Kennedy family's strong association with Democratic politics. That contrast is revealing. Families are never as uniform as public mythology makes them appear. The Kennedy name suggests a political identity, but individual lives move in different directions. Douglas's career showed that a child of the dynasty could step into media rather than elected politics and could occupy spaces not always associated with the family brand. He also experienced public controversy, including a reported hospital incident in 2012 involving nurses and his newborn son. The case brought unwelcome attention, another example of how quickly a private conflict can become public when the surname is Kennedy. Douglas continued his career and family life, but like his siblings, he could never fully leave the orbit of the name. Then there was Rory. Rory Kennedy was born on December 12, 1968, 6 months after her father was assassinated. She was the child born into absence. The others had lost Robert Kennedy. Rory never had him. Her father was already a memory before she entered the world. He existed in photographs, speeches, film clips, campaign posters, family stories, national grief, and the faces of siblings who had known him. That kind of absence is not empty. It is full of other people's memories. Rory grew up surrounded by a father everyone seemed to know except her. The country mourned him. Her mother loved him. Her siblings remembered him. Historians wrote about him. Politicians invoked him. Strangers spoke of what he might have become. But for Rory, he was the missing person at the center of her life. Perhaps that helps explain why she became a documentary filmmaker. Documentary film is a search for truth through memory, testimony, images, and what remains after events have passed. It asks people to look again. It preserves what might otherwise be simplified or forgotten. Rory made films on subjects far beyond the Kennedy family, including social, political, and humanitarian issues. But her work has always carried the seriousness of someone who understands that stories matter, because people disappear, history distorts, and public memory is never complete. In 2012, she made a documentary about her mother, titled Ethel. That project was intimate in a way few outsiders could have achieved. It was not simply a film about a famous widow. It was a daughter asking who her mother had been, what she had endured, and how a family survived so much loss without allowing grief to become the only story. For Rory, filmmaking became both profession and inheritance. She could not remember her father, but she could examine memory itself. Across all 11 children, the family pattern becomes visible. Not one fate, but many. Kathleen, who carried the responsibilities of the eldest daughter. Joe, the oldest son whose political future changed course. Robert Jr., the controversial survivor whose life moved from addiction to environmental advocacy to public division. David, the wounded son who died young. Courtney, who lived partly in the public world and partly away from it. Michael, the energetic son lost suddenly after scandal. Kerry, the human rights advocate who turned legacy into work. Christopher, the businessman and civic figure who sought political office. Matthew, the private one whose quieter life may represent its own form of escape. Douglas, the journalist who lived within and beyond the family's political identity. Rory, the child born after the loss, who became a keeper of stories. 11 lives, each shaped by the same parents, each altered by the same assassination, each watched by the same public, but each different. That is why the story cannot be reduced to a curse. The word curse is dramatic, but it is too simple. It makes tragedy sound like destiny. It makes human pain sound like folklore. The truth is more difficult. The Kennedy children grew up with enormous privilege. They had wealth, education, homes, connections, and opportunities that most people never receive. But privilege can protect the surface while leaving the interior exposed. It can pay for schools, but not replace a father. It can provide security, but not privacy. It can surround a child with adults, but not guarantee that the right person notices the right wound at the right time. Their family name gave them a place in history, but it also took away the ordinary freedom to become unknown. That is one of the cruelest things about inherited fame. Most children are allowed to become themselves slowly. They are allowed to be awkward, mistaken, rebellious, uncertain, and unfinished in relative privacy. Ethel Kennedy's children did not have that luxury. Their mistakes were more visible. Their pain was more interesting to strangers. Their achievements were often interpreted through legacy. Their failures were folded into myth. The public saw them as Kennedys before it saw them as people. Ethel had to mother them through all of that. Her own image became almost impossibly strong. She was the widow who never remarried, the Catholic matriarch, the woman of 11 children, the survivor of assassinations, accidents, overdose, scandal, and decades of public grief. But there is a danger in admiring someone's strength too much. It can make their suffering invisible. Ethel's strength was real, but she was not made of stone. She had lost her husband. She had buried 2 sons. She had watched other children struggle. She had seen the family name become both shield and target. She had endured the public's appetite for Kennedy tragedy, an appetite that often disguised itself as sympathy. She kept going because she had to, because children still needed her, because the family still gathered, because faith still mattered, because Robert's memory still had work to do in the world. Her Catholic faith remained central to how she understood suffering and endurance. For Ethel, faith was not decorative. It was not simply part of the Kennedy image. It was a structure strong enough to hold grief when nothing else could. She also had humor. People who knew her often described her wit, her energy, her refusal to become sentimental in the easy way. That too was part of her survival. Humor can be a form of defiance. It can keep grief from taking every room in the house. Still, the cost was real. The cost was David. The cost was Michael. The cost was the childhoods altered by assassination. The cost was the public scrutiny around addiction, divorce controversy, and grief. The cost was the pressure placed on children to continue a legacy they had not chosen. The cost was the difference between being loved by the public and being truly left alone. As the decades passed, Ethel's children moved further into their own lives. They became parents. Some became grandparents. The family expanded. New generations arrived, carrying the Kennedy name with less direct memory of Robert, but still with the weight of what the name meant. Yet the pattern of loss did not entirely disappear. The extended Kennedy family continued to experience tragedy, including the death of Sawise Kennedy Hill, the daughter of Courtney Kennedy Hill, in 2019. For Ethel, this meant another young life lost within the family circle. Another reminder that survival does not mean suffering has ended. Still, the family continued. That continuation is part of the story too. It would be easy to make the Kennedy family only a tragedy. It would also be false. There was love. There was work. There were children born, marriages made, campaigns fought, books written, films created, causes defended, and gatherings that still looked full of life. There were grandchildren who grew up hearing stories not only of death, but of purpose. There were public honors, private jokes, family rituals, and the ordinary stubbornness of people who keep making dinner, keeping birthdays, keeping memory. The Kennedys survived not because tragedy spared them, but because they learned how to live with it in the room. That does not mean they always lived with it well. It means they lived. For Ethel's 11 children, the inheritance was never only financial or social. It was emotional, it was historical, it was almost spiritual. They inherited the question of what Robert Kennedy's life had meant. They inherited the public's desire for another Kennedy to rise. They inherited the expectation that suffering should become service. They inherited the lesson that a family must keep moving. But some pain cannot simply be converted into mission. David's life showed that. Michael's death showed that. Robert Jr.'s controversies showed that inheritance can fracture into conflict. Joe's retreat from higher political ambition showed that the dynastic path could narrow. Rory's films showed that memory itself needed examination. Kerry's advocacy showed that legacy could become institution. Kathleen's career showed that public service could be steady, even without reaching the highest office. The quieter siblings showed that survival can happen away from headlines. Together they form not a single tragic line, but a complicated map of what inherited fame does to a family. When Ethel Kennedy died in 2024 at the age of 96, she left behind a family that had grown far beyond the 11 children she raised. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, public institutions, political memories, and private stories continued after her. The tributes remembered her as a matriarch, a human rights advocate, a woman of faith, and the widow of Robert Kennedy. All of that was true, but perhaps the most important truth was simpler. She was a mother who raised 11 children after her husband was murdered, a mother who had to carry grief while making a home, a mother who watched some children flourish and others suffer, a mother who buried 2 sons, a mother who lived long enough to see the Kennedy name change, fracture, endure, and continue. The world often remembers families like the Kennedys through images: a black car, a campaign stage, a White House on a hill, children on a lawn, a widow in mourning, a funeral procession. But images do not tell us what it feels like to live afterward. They do not show the child trying to understand why a father is not coming home. They do not show the mother listening for trouble in a house full of voices. They do not show the son trying to escape pain through substances. They do not show the daughter trying to turn grief into purpose. They do not show the private exhaustion of carrying a name everyone else thinks they understand. Ethel Kennedy's 11 children were born into a family that seemed to have everything: money, beauty, power, access, history. But the story of their lives proves that inheritance can be both a gift and a wound. A famous name can open doors, but it can also trap the people born behind it. A great house can shelter a family, but it cannot keep grief outside forever. A mother can be strong enough to survive almost anything and still be unable to save every child from the pain that follows them. The world saw the Kennedy children as heirs to a dream, but dreams can be heavy when they belong to the dead. And in the end, the most difficult inheritance Ethel Kennedy's children received was not wealth or status or public admiration. It was the burden of becoming themselves inside a story the world had already written for them. The public remembered the glamour, the family remembered the cost, and somewhere between those two truths lies the real tragedy of Ethel Kennedy and her 11 children.